All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Mavs Film Room podcast. We come to you tonight at around 10:15 p.m. Central Time on Tuesday, November 17th. It is the night before the 2020 NBA Draft. It took longer than we expected, but nonetheless, we're almost there. I'm joined as always by my co-hosts, Rohan and Fazil.
Hey, what's up?
Illustrious, most legendary in the game.
Yes, sir.
All right, Obama.
Let me be clear. Luka Doncic is better than Michael Jordan.
Trump just signed an executive order that says Michael Jordan is better than Luka Doncic.
Politics.
Politics. We did not come here to talk about politics. In fact, we came here to talk about the NBA draft and specifically the Mavs transaction potential surrounding the NBA draft.
Yeah, the Mavs haven't done much, have they, guys? And it's kind of been depressing everyone on Twitter.
I mean, raise your hand if you totally saw this coming, because I did, But you know what? In the Mavs' defense, and I want to be clear, I'm not being paid by the Mavs to say this, but in their defense, I think given the condensed nature of this offseason, and I think the types of deals that needed to go down, like the Chris Paul trade, and then of course the few deals that went down with Drew Holiday and Bogdan Bogdanovic and Robert Covington, I think certain teams like the Mavericks are sort of waiting to get a sense of where things stand on the NBA front with teams who have already made deals and what the fallout from that is, especially when you consider the Mavs can really only trade their first-round pick during the draft, given the rules that surround trading first-round picks. They're not allowed to trade it until that point. And actually, the Mavericks will not be able to trade a first-round pick prior to the draft until the year 2027. So, guys, we'll be 30 years old the next time the Mavs can trade a first-round pick prior to the draft.
Yeah! Next decade of dominance, baby! Yeah, so obviously none of us are Mavs Draft himself. None of us are the illustrious Richie Stayman, but I think we have a good idea through osmosis of who Mavs fans really want. And I think the number one guy has to be Desmond Bain, right?
At least that's what it looks like on Twitter, yes.
Yeah, I think Bane makes a ton of sense when you consider the fact that he's a four-year player in college, so he's a guy who's like more or less a finished product at this point. But when you watch his film, he definitely strikes you as a guy who has a very good feel for the game, has a very solid jump shot, which is always valuable, especially for a team like the Mavericks, and one who has an NBA-ready body. So he's not really a guy that, we've seen the Mavs draft in the past where it's like a 2 or 3 year project that they usually never see through. Like
This
Bane
is not
is
a Justin Anderson situation, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, funny that you mentioned Justin Anderson. I think Desmond Bain really reminds me of what the Mavs envisioned Justin Anderson becoming, but clearly never did.
It really comes down to the versatility of the guy. I think it's very rare to see somebody like Desmond Bain in the late first round that it has that much of an upside and can play in so many different facets.
Yeah, I definitely think that if Bane was younger and was producing at this level, I think he would without a doubt be a lottery pick.
Right, but the Mavs, obviously, having a great core already intact, really just need somebody who can be a role player or more. And for that reason, I guess, Desmond Bain's upside does give him, although he has a lower ceiling than a lot of the top guys, his upside and his higher floor gives him, I think, a lot of positives in playing next to a guy like Luka, who's already a high basketball IQ, was playing pro already. I think he's not going to miss a step. And I guess in terms of character, I can understand why the Mavs front office might prioritize him.
Yeah, he's a guy who, like we said, is sort of already a finished product. But the upside to that is he can step in from day one and be, a guy who plays like 20 minutes per game in this rotation. And I think it's important to understand that, yes, Bane is 22 years old. He's not 19 or 20 like some of the top guys are. But the Mavs aren't drafting right now to get the next face of the franchise. Like they're drafting to get a role player who can step in and contribute. And the main advantages of that is it's a guy who is on a team-friendly contract for the next 4 years. And Bane is certainly, a great player who fits that mold.
Yeah. It also helps with the cap because obviously the Mavs are working mostly with the MLE right now. And we've already seen, and we talked about in the last episode, about the Jalen Brunson archetype. The players that play all 4 years, have a high basketball IQ, high motor. The Mavs really like those guys.
Right. Good thing you mentioned Jalen, because I was about to say, yeah, Desmond Bain is going to be closer to Jalen Brunson than he will be to Justin Anderson. Although it's fair to know that Justin Anderson did play 3 seasons of college ball himself, and so did Jalen Brunson. But whatever it was, maybe it was just getting drafted to a shitty team and not being quite as good as anticipated. Justin Anderson's level of play obviously didn't live up to what we thought he would be for the Mavs, at least.
Yeah.
He was definitely a raw prospect. I remember in the early days of this production when I was writing those breakdowns, and when I go back to it, I can see the flaws. Obviously, there are holes in Justin Anderson's game. There are obviously holes in Desmond Bain's game, but I think it goes back to exactly what Jay was saying, and I think we all agree on it. You don't need a perfect 5-star blue chip prospect,
Yeah, I mean, when you think about what the Mavs were when they drafted Justin Anderson versus what the Mavs are right now going into this draft, 2 worlds apart. I think with Justin Anderson, the Mavs were looking for a guy that, okay, could he be part of, the youth movement that they were trying to start, in the twilight years of Dirk's career. Now they're literally trying to use the 18th pick, whether through the draft or the trade, to actively improve their supporting cast, in anticipation for the fact that Luka is going to be signing a huge extension here in the next couple of years, and their window for improving is now, because once that extension is signed, their flexibility gets limited,
right,
a lot. So I know Desmond Bain is a pretty popular name when it comes to the Mavericks on Mavs Twitter. Seems like, just the combination of him being a DFW guy and the fact that he's such a, fluid athlete already, it almost makes too much sense to pick Desmond Bain at 18. But there's a few other guys in the mix there, whether it's at 18 or, potentially reaching and trading up. But there's another one that I want to talk about that seems like he'll be available. He's also pretty popular pick in some of the mock drafts that I've seen, and that's Josh Green, who is a forward out of Arizona. He's a freshman.
Josh Green, I know that there was some conversations about whether he would be in next year's draft class or this year's. Him being in this year's draft class does definitely mean that he's a guy with at least some upside, and some serious upside. But that being said, there are definite holes in his game, and that's why we talked about him after Desmond. That's why we talked about him after Desmond Bain. Fazal, what do you know about his weaknesses? From what I've heard, he's a pretty solid offensive player, at least in terms of his potential, but he has some holes on that end as well.
Yeah, probably the biggest hole in his game is his ball handling, and that, I suppose, speaks to his limited creation ability.
Yeah, I think that's like one of the biggest legs up that Bane has on a guy like Josh Green is just the ability to create, because like we know from watching the Mavs this past season that creators is something that they are looking to add to the roster. And while it is pretty attractive to see a guy like Josh Green, who's only like 20 years old or 19 years old and possesses a fairly solid 3-point shot and has got good length, and that really jumps off the page at you as a guy who you could pick who has like a ton of upside. But, on the flip side, you think about it, like what if, he doesn't quite pan out the way that we expect? Because going back to Justin Anderson, I think one of the big reasons that he was available and was picked as high as he was, I think the Mavs had the 15th pick or so that year. Yeah. He made a huge leap in his 3-point shooting from his sophomore year to his junior year. And a lot of people were thinking like, well, was that a fluke or not? And turns out it was a fluke, and he just couldn't shoot in the NBA. So while obviously Josh Green is a freshman, this sample size that we're seeing from him, how reliable is it? The questions still remain.
That's fair. I think the thing that we have to, as Mavs fans, kind of understand is that Josh Green may be a guy that is being drafted a little too high at 18. But there's a definite possibility that the Mavericks don't stick with the 18th pick, and we'll talk about that more once we get through the prospects themselves. And in that case, I think if they specifically move down, he's a good choice. That also being said, I don't think you need necessarily a creator with that pick. But that being said, if Josh Green falls and he's a guy that you can get closer to 31 or the end of the first round, I would say, there's very little downside to it, because next to Luka, if his shot is working or if it's at least serviceable, the spacing may take care of itself. I mean, that's really what the system is built towards. So in terms of the fit, I'm not necessarily concerned, but definitely in terms of that floor and ceiling, I don't think it's comparable to Bane at the very least. Definitely none of the more blockbuster guys that the Mavs might trade up to get even.
Yeah, let's talk about a few of those guys. So a few names that jump off the board immediately is Saddiq Bey as well as Devin Vassell.
Right.
I think we can all agree that they are probably out of reach of the Mavs unless they want to give up some assets to trade up. But I think it's still worth talking about them because they do, fit the mold of a player that the Mavs do need.
Yeah. Obviously, my question comes down to who do you think even gets us a pick that lands us Saddiq Bey? Like, I'm not confident about that, and yeah, you can say OKC, but I mean, it's even a stretch whether he's going to be there at like 15, right? I think the issue with this draft is there's a lot of guys, I think, from the end of the lottery down to like 20 that could honestly be picked anywhere in that range.
Right. So this is the deal that Mavs Draft said. He has, and a lot of other draft experts have never seen a draft where the ceilings and floors of where a player can get picked in this draft have been so wildly inconsistent. Apart from the top 5, maybe 10, really 5 prospects who are most commonly put up in the top 5, like LaMelo Ball, Anthony Edwards, Wiseman, those types of guys. Obi Toppin, right. You can have a player that's projected anywhere from number 5, number 6, all the way to out of the draft. Yeah. So it's just tough. If you want a specific player in mind, instead of saying, hey, we should go after whoever the hell falls to us, that's when you trade up. That's when you should trade up. And to get Saddiq Bey, I'd say a pretty good way to do that would be perhaps to trade with Phoenix, who possesses pick number 10 still after the Chris Paul trade. And we have 18, we have 31. We could package both of those and another player such as DeLon Wright or Dwight Powell. I don't know about Dwight, but DeLon specifically because he would be a good backup to Chris Paul, and the Suns are a little weak in terms of their guard depth after Paul, Booker, and then Mikal Bridges, who mostly will play the 3 anyway.
Right.
So to get Saddiq Bey, right, you'd probably want something along the lines of 18, 31, DeLon Wright for number 10, and I don't know, something else. And with Phoenix's situation, now that they just landed Chris Paul, I have a feeling they don't really care so much about where their pick is going to end up if they decide to deal it, because now they just have a wealth of options, right?
Right. I mean, that's a good point, and I do think there's significantly more upside to only going up to 10. On last episode, I did discuss how, I mean, if the Mavs are going to trade up, like, if they're going to trade up all the way to the top, and if they're trying to break into, like, the top of the lottery, I do think the guy that they're trying to get is Obi Toppin, because he's the real mix between that high upside guy and the guy that can immediately be a role player. And I feel like he fits in the depth chart. But that being said, I do think for the dynasty building vision of this team, Saddiq Bey and Desmond Bain specifically fit better. But a move for Saddiq Bey would, in my mind, have to take Dwight Powell. Like, I don't see how that wouldn't take Dwight Powell. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Because
I think
haven't the Suns lost Aaron Baines or whoever? Like, they don't have him on the roster, right? He's a free agent.
He's a free agent.
Yeah.
He's a free agent. So
I think certain people are expecting them to lose him this offseason, but it's still unclear as to what will happen. But yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I do think if the Mavs do want to get up to, like, say, pick number 10 with the Suns, it is going to cost them. And, I think to Fazl's point, he did mention DeLon Wright. I think it might cost a guy like Jalen Brunson, Jalen Brunson, on the
Yeah.
note of Mavs trade assets, is probably like the biggest wild card right now,
Yeah.
because Brunson is one of their younger guys. He was picked the same year as Luka, and I think he's still kind of a wild card, like even as to how he fits on the roster, given that he missed so much time with the shoulder injury last year. So I do wonder what his value is in the trade market, and if it could help the Mavs move up in the draft or land a better player because he qualifies as quote unquote young talent. That remains to be seen.
I actually agree with you there. I think he actually has a decent amount of value for the Mavs. And I think primarily that's because any point guard that can exist in Rick Carlisle's system, I think other GMs in the league are going to look at that and be like, hey, that's a pedigree right there. That's a pedigree that matters, right? Especially for a young guy. If a young guy's coachable, I mean, that's just something that you don't necessarily see all that often. So
Yeah, he's certainly a good player, and I think if he can get the consistent reps, we'll really get to see how what kind of player he will be going.
I
forward.
definitely see him as more of like a Shabazz Napier type Brunson. Like,
Yeah,
I think if the Mavs trade him, he could very well end up being like a journeyman type role, and I think he could succeed in that, quite honestly.
yeah, he's kind of an old school point guard that I think his ceiling is being like a floor general for a bench unit of some team. I don't think he would ever become like a consistent starter.
Yeah.
I mean, he could be a starter, but obviously, well, okay. This isn't
Yeah,
even this isn't about
this is
Jalen
not
Brunson.
the
Yeah,
draft talk.
I think the point is Jalen Brunson is a wild card to both the Mavs' plans next season as well as their desire to upgrade their roster right now.
Right. Um,
Yeah.
Now that we've talked about Obi Toppin as well, I think the last guy that we can talk about, I would rather Fossil just talk about, because he brought him up on the last episode.
That would be Alexi Pokashevsky, who is definitely one of the highest upside prospects in the draft, one of the youngest, if not the youngest. And he is described as sort of a unicorn type of player in the mold of Kristaps and so many other, well, not so many other, but just the sort of big man unicorn player who can create for others, who can shoot out to the 3-point line.
You've never seen a stampede of unicorns before, Fossil? God, you're so unworldly and uncultured, my dude.
Wait, so he's
I'm
a
sorry, I'm not a fucking brony, Rohan.
Friendship is magic, my friend.
So he's like a 7-foot shooter from Europe. In other words, the next Dirk Nowitzki.
It could be.
I mean, but they say that about every single tall shooter from Europe, okay?
Or Ryan Kelly in some offenses.
Andrea Bargnani. Not that I think Pokashevsky's going to be Bargnani. Scouting has gotten much better than that. So is training. That being said, he's a guy that's available, I think, at 18, right? Do you think he's going to be gone by 31?
By 31,
so.
absolutely.
I think so. We should talk about 31 also. But, on the note of Pokashevsky, I've seen him picked in some mock drafts with the Mavs. I've read that they're interested in him, but just looking at the goals for this team, I don't think he fits in, given that they already have their own, unicorn and Kristaps Porzingis. And I think he's a guy who will probably take a few years to develop. He's not someone who could step in right away and make an impact.
That's true, but the Mavs, I think, can afford to take that. I think we should look at how the Warriors drafted when they were drafting Draymond and Harrison Barnes, right? That was like the end of a very long process for them. And even when they did that, they still had they still had Steph's rookie contract and rookie scale to work with, right? So ultimately, being in the position where we have Luka and we know he's going to sign an extension, I'm very tired of hearing the Mavs constantly being like, oh, we need to swing for the fences this offseason, or like keep ourselves ready to swing for the fences next offseason. Just make a good team. Just improve
I agree.
this team.
I agree with that for sure.
And give Luka pieces that he can be confident are going to be good and with him for multiple years. That's all you need to do. And so if you're gonna select Pokashevsky, and I hope I'm saying that right, I think you have to sign or trade for a wing, because as soon as you draft him, you need a guy who can contribute right away from the wing spot. If you're gonna draft a guy with a lot of upside but isn't necessarily there yet on the wing, then you're going to need to go and really go for a forward. I feel, because Kristaps is playing the 5 now.
Well,
Yeah.
the deal is if you select Pokashevsky, you might, since he's a project and all, and a super young one who's one of the more raw players in the draft, you're probably going to flip him for something else.
Yeah, that brings me to like my other point is that personally, given the circumstances surrounding Pokashevsky and his young age and generally the fact that he's going to need a few years to develop, I don't think the Mavs are looking to pick a guy like him. I could be totally wrong, but just reading the situation, that's what strikes to me is that if they do pick at 18, it's going to be a guy like Bane or Saddiq Bey if he falls that low, someone who could step in from day one and play in the rotation. With Pokashevsky, I have read that Oklahoma City is very hell bent on selecting him due to his agent's ties with Sam Presti, the GM of the Thunder. So I sort of reading between the lines, it almost seems like the Thunder are a potential draft night trade partner for the Mavericks.
Yeah.
The Thunder have a few guys like Kelly Oubre, Danny Green, Danilo Gallinari in a potential sign and trade. So all wings and players of the Mavs have expressed interest in at one point or another. And on the flip side, the Thunder are looking to move into a spot where they could get a guy that they really want, that they believe can help be part of their core that they're looking to rebuild here in the next few years.
31, if there's a trade, will probably be packaged with 18. But if it isn't, who do you think the Mavs are going to pick?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with some of the second round picks, as I'm not too familiar with the first round picks either. Again, I'm not Mavs Draft, but I think
None of us are.
None of us are. Yeah, he's a unique talent, and shout out to Mavs Draft for all the work he's put in towards the draft. Every year it seems like he's getting better, much like a draft pick.
Wow.
But yeah, a guy that I've noticed that seems to have fallen out of the first round in some of the earlier mocks is Jameis Ramsey, who is a shooting guard, small forward from Texas Tech.
Okay. I mean, there is that local connection. I mean, that's a big reason why I think people were aware of Desmond Bain, and I think also a big reason as to why he was such a good fit. So I think at 31, that could be comfortable, but I don't know much about him. So is he a low ceiling guy? Like, where do you see that?
I think he's more or less like a medium floor, low ceiling type guy. Like I think when you draft him, you're gonna more or less know what he is. I mean, I think like one of the biggest pluses is that he's only 21 years old.
Okay.
Actually, no, sorry, he's 19 years old. So for a second round pick, that is kind of a steal when it comes to age. Usually second round picks are, in the 21,
Yeah.
21 to 23 year age. He's a plus 3-point shooter. I think is a pretty solid athlete too. So you get a guy who has good defensive potential. But I think there's probably a reason that he's fallen into the second round from the first round, namely his inefficiency when it comes to shooting, his general lack of efficiency as a player. I think he's a guy who is kind of a bull in that he takes a lot of shots, but isn't quite, a knockdown shooter. So, but I feel like in the right role, he could succeed.
Yeah. I also think that there are going to be some people available in the second round in this draft that we were expecting to go significantly earlier. I think with how Richie has been talking about this draft, with what Fazal said earlier about how the ceilings and floors just being all crazy and wild, unlike anything we've ever seen before, I think it's very likely that we might even end up, if the Mavs still have the pick, getting somebody that we didn't think would be there.
Yeah, I think as Fazal said earlier, this draft is kind of a strange one in that, one, obviously because of the pandemic and everything surrounding that, there's a lot of uncertainty with how teams are going to approach this. Two, being even before the pandemic and, dating back to last year, the year before, 2020's draft was viewed as generally kind of a weak one in terms of there might be, 2 or 3 guys who are locks to be solid all-star potential players, but after that it gets a lot less clear. And so, but despite the weakness of this draft, it is pretty deep at the wing position. So that, obviously with the wing being the most important position in the NBA these days, creates a lot of uncertainty in that, like, how are our players going, or sorry, how are teams going to, evaluate certain wings and prioritize them over others. And ultimately, that is what's really going to, affect how the draft plays out tomorrow night.
I got you there. What do you think exists in terms of draft night moves for non-prospects? So, for example, Zach LaVine is somebody that we talked about in the last episode on Monday, and it's somebody that we love. We know Mavs Twitter, Dalton Trigg. Shouts out to you. Thank you for keeping Zach LaVine to Dallas alive, even when Kenny's trying to troll us and say that he's going to take the ball away from Luka.
I think he was trolling. I don't think he was being serious about
No, Kenny
that.
was definitely trolling. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fossil made that clear to me.
Yes.
Hey, but I will get on Kenny's case for Drummond.
Yeah, man. I'm sorry. Like, that's one thing I feel very strongly about is, like, Andre Drummond has no place on this team for a variety of reasons, namely that he doesn't make them better.
Ooh.
That, and he doesn't fit the team construction. I mean,
He doesn't. Here's my thing with Drummond. He just comes across as a guy who cares more about stats than winning. I mean, his stats are great. There's no denying that. But there's also a reason why Detroit was so eager to get rid of him. He plays sort of an antiquated position, makes a ton of money, and never really furthered their goal of winning.
Right.
There's a reason Cleveland only gave up what they did to get him.
Yeah.
There really wasn't a market for him. They were floating the Mavs every single week for like months, and there really wasn't a market for him. And that tells you, I mean, where the league is right now. So, do you think that there's a deal the Mavs can make for a guy of LaVine's caliber, or do you think that's just like locked off at this point?
It's possible. I don't want to say no because we have seen in the past the Mavs have surprised us with, like, how little they gave up to get certain guys, like, Kristaps, for example.
Right.
Or even Luka for that matter. Like, yes, they had to sacrifice a first round pick, but I mean, in retrospect, you make that deal 10 times out of 10.
That being said, with Noel and Kristaps, those are both guys that, like, their teams didn't have a lot of leverage in that situation, like their value was going down. And so those trades were made out of a sense of urgency. So, for example, the Justin Anderson one for Noel. I mean, although we did get better talent as a team, there's a reason why Noel was there, right? And Kristaps wanted out of New York. I don't know if Zach wants out of Chicago like that.
Yeah, I think definitely if Boylan was still the coach, I would 100% think that LaVine would want out of Chicago, given the issues that he had with Boylan as a coach. Of course, that's not the case now, so that's a little bit unclear. I think we talked about a little bit yesterday on our phone call before the show, like, and even in NBA circles, like, what Chicago is going to do is, like, one of the biggest mysteries right now. Like, who are they targeting in the draft? Are they planning a full-scale rebuild, or do they sort of like what they have? I mean, we know they like guys like Markkanen and Wendell Carter, right, but how does LaVine fit into those plans? That's unclear. And if they're more eager than not to ship him off for, like, a full-scale rebuild, then I could see the Mavs, swooping in with the 18th and 31 pick, and maybe, adding other guys. Like, of course, they would have to add a Hardaway and probably Jalen Brunson.
Yeah.
But I would think that's unlikely.
So you're talking about guys on LaVine's tier. The only other guy who I could think of potentially would be Bradley Beal, but for a bunch of reasons, including this new news with Westbrook and John Wall maybe being traded for each other, I don't think a Beal deal is coming anytime soon. And I just spat out a nice bar.
Bars, baby.
Yeah.
Bars.
The Mavs definitely don't have the ammo to do a deal for Beal. That's a bar for you right there.
Going back to the LaVine stuff, like, I've just been letting it marinate in my head a little bit. Like, okay, so the move that we saw the Bulls make is they're basically like letting Chris Dunn become an unrestricted free agent, which it's not a huge loss, but they also did retain Denzel Valentine, which doesn't make sense to me, right? So in my head, like, there's so little logic there that there's one world in which they are simply trying to rebuild and get as many assets for who they have right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they're just trying to appreciate the value on guys like Markkanen and Carter Jr. And LaVine's value has already appreciated over this past season. Like, he had a really great season. So if that's the case, I can see them trying to trade him for, assets in the draft as well as some other players that could fit, especially with them not having Chris Dunn anymore. But that also being said, it seems as if they may be logically, if there is some logic to what they're doing, other than just a fire sale, this could be a situation where they're trying to get rid of Chris Dunn because they have a glut at the guard position, which kind of makes sense, and that they keep Zach LaVine because he is their best player and they want to sell tickets. And I honestly, I think that's far more likely.
I think so too.
That brings us to Buddy Hield. Buddy Hield seems to be one of those. Buddy Hield, Kelly Oubre seem to be the two guys that I think are feasible to get from a draft day trade. And we already talked about Oubre with the Thunder, but
yeah,
I would add Oladipo into that mix too, especially. I think Zach Lowe today on either a podcast or something of that nature said that Oladipo's trade value is basically zero right now. Like, him and Westbrook have like zero trade value. So, when you hear something like that, I think we've always said that we're not huge fans of Oladipo. But if you have a chance to buy low on a talent like that, it might make sense. On the note of Buddy Hield, I think that was a lot more likely before they made the trade with the Bucks last night, with Bogdan and Bogdanovic. I think now that clears up Buddy Hield's spot in the starting lineup. I just don't see that happening anymore.
Yeah, it's right. Really tough.
There's one more name that I think should be mentioned because of all the news that's coming today. Gordon Hayward, he might be on his way out of Boston. It looks like it. There were already rumors brewing that he was apparently going to maybe opt into his deal anyway because it's like fucking $30 million. Right. But he felt betrayed by the Celtics organization about his declining role, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But, sometimes players are just irrational beings. We're all human, right?
He was sold when he and Kyrie came there. He was kind of sold on being with his college coach, having a solid position there. And then they drafted Jason Tatum and Jalen Brown. And now he's out. He's locked out of the depth chart and coming back from an injury,
Yeah, and let's also just not forget that his Boston Celtics tenure, started off on a very inauspicious note with the ankle injury. So it's just sort of been a cursed time in Boston for him. I'm sure he wants to get out.
I'm all for actually a Gordon Hayward trade. My issue also comes down to feasibility, and this is what maybe I'm just traumatized, guys. Maybe I'm just traumatized because the Mavs fucking lose every single time they try to do something. Oh my god, let me calm down. I think he's going to go to Atlanta. I think Capella is probably the best a piece that has been floated for Gordon Hayward. But that being said, it's pretty ironic considering that Dwight Powell was originally a pick by the Celtics. But if they're willing to take him and some cap filler, which I honestly doubt that they would because it's Danny Ainge, and Danny Ainge is a fucking lunatic when it comes to this stuff. And he's going to want to get the better side of the deal no matter what. But at the same time, like you just said, Gordon Hayward has a gigantic deal, and so you have to give, somebody for that.
You'd have to trade Tim Hardaway Jr. There's no way. Without trading him.
Isn't Powell making 11 a year?
Roughly,
I think so.
And then DeLon is making 9, right?
9, yeah.
So if you package them together, that's 20, and then I feel like you can kind of make up the rest of the 10. Probably with the MLE, right? Can you absorb that contract into the MLE?
No, I don't think you can.
I don't think so. Here's the deal, though, with Tim, and the thing that makes this a Mavs specific thing to look at is, in the midst of all the Gordon Hayward news, it was let known that the Celtics were trying to lobby the NBA for extending the opt-in decision deadline to be Thursday afternoon for Hayward, which also lines up with Tim Hardaway Jr.'s opt-in decision deadline. And that obviously takes place after the draft. So if the Mavs are lucky enough to draft somebody that the Celtics want, package him with Tim and maybe Dwight, that would be roughly, I would say, maybe in the ballpark of Hayward.
Yeah, it would be. You know, when the news broke that the Celtics and Hayward were trying to work that out, I was almost convinced that the Mavs were the team that was trying to trade for him. Of course, you know, like you said, Atlanta has been the rumor team, but you know, reading some stuff, you know, from Dallas writers, they make a good point that Donnie Nelson and Danny Ainge have a very close relationship and have a history of making deals together. So I think it would be something to look out for.
Not only that, I also think a part of it is they don't want to. It's not as much as the Drew Holiday situation, because Drew Holiday is genuinely an intimidating defender, one of the best defenders in the league. And if you're the Pelicans, you don't want to see him, 4 times a year if you trade him to Dallas. I get that. But in this case, I don't think they want to see Gordon Hayward like 3 times a year either. I really doubt that. But that being said, I'm surprised that they're not trying to throw around Jalen Brown. I feel like this was the off season where if everything had gone normally, I would have expected him almost to be moved. I would have expected that to be a big thing.
You think so?
I think that they're trying to clear up a spot for him, and obviously Drew Holiday going to the Bucks hurt, I think, the possibility of that move happening. I don't think the Celtics have an urgency to do it, but I think that if they wanted to move him, they could get, a Bradley Beal out of Washington. I think that's more likely than trading Westbrook for Wall at this point.
They could, but the vibe I've gotten with Boston all season, now that the season's played out, and Brown was one of their best two-way players and one of their most consistent scorers, he averaged about 20 a game, is that he and Tatum are a really great duo that's going to grow together a lot. Those two, Marcus Smart, are probably their core 3 guys going forward. And if any of the big contracts apart from Hayward are expendable in terms of Boston, it would be Kemba Walker. I think weren't they trying to offload him? That news broke as well.
Yeah, they were trying to replace him with Drew.
With Holiday.
Yeah.
I saw a report today that the Celtics are trying to, frantically trying to offload Kemba Walker and Gordon Hayward in an effort to get into the Harden sweepstakes. I don't know how true that is or not.
Yeah, I doubt that. Because that's kind of along the lines of what I was thinking. I was thinking that you would have to get rid of Brown if you wanted a guy like James Harden, if you wanted one of the guards that has to leave. But at the same time, those guys don't have a ton of value right now, and the teams that are trading guys like Harden, specifically in Harden's case, he's not going to get traded for months now.
The Rockets don't really have much of an urgency to move him, I don't think.
The Westbrook one is obviously more urgent.
Yeah.
That being said, do you think there's anyone besides the Celtics that the Mavs are kind of trying to make a move with?
I think OKC is probably, in my opinion, just based on what I've read, seems to be the most likely trade partner right now. We don't even know for sure if the Mavs and Celtics have talked. I'm sure they have, but I still don't know how likely that is. Because, like I said, initially when the news broke, I was pretty convinced that it was going to be the Mavs. But then, a few hours later, it got said that Hayward wants a multi-year deal. So any scenario in which Boston trades him would be a sign and trade. So then I was a little bit less certain whether it would be the Mavs, unless they're willing to go multiple years with Gordon Hayward, which means they actually do view him as a part of their team.
And their long-term future. I actually don't mind that. I mean, look at Monte Ellis and Steph Curry, for example. Obviously, Luka now is better than Steph was at that parallel moment, obviously, right? But you need that second dude who may not be the Robin that takes Luka to the championship, but is still older, a veteran, has been through the league, and on top of that is a hard worker. And on top of all of those things, even though he is coming off of, an injury history, he can still shoot pretty well, man. He's a really good offensive wing when he's healthy.
Yeah, statistically speaking, I wouldn't go this far, but statistically speaking, Hayward looked like the exact same player he was in Utah with just a reduced usage rate. So I wouldn't make that comparison because I think he has it a lot easier in Boston now that he's not the primary scoring option.
Of course.
But just because of his situation, he's roughly as effective, I guess, by advanced stats.
Well, even when qualifying that, I do think it is pretty impressive that your statistics and your analytics can be comparable on a team that is so much better and where you are a tertiary option. Like, that takes a lot of skill and knowing when and where to pick your shots, what role you're playing, all of that stuff.
Yeah, we always talk about the Mavs needing another creator, and I think Gordon Hayward fits that role pretty well.
It really comes down to, are you overpaying in a way that this is going to be like a toxic poison pill contract that you have to also get rid of assets for? That's the only thing I'm worried about on a Gordon Hayward deal. That being said, I think those are pretty much all of the likely moves. I also think that the Nuggets might be trying to do something on draft day. I get that feeling. So we'll see. I don't know if they're trying to move up or something like that, but
yeah, they have a nice package of young talent they can offer. So it'll be interesting to see. A lot of people pegged them as the leader in the holiday sweepstakes. Of course, he ended up going to Milwaukee in the trade. But
well, they have guys that I think they would like to move. I think Gary Harris is worth moving right now for them.
Yes.
So I can see them packaging Gary Harris in their pick to try to move up a little bit, pick somebody with a little more upside. And if they do end up picking a wing, I mean, that could snowball into them not really wanting to pick up Jeremy Grant. Like, maybe they think it's a cheaper option. We don't know.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that could happen, tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to it.
It's going to be wild.
One last point on the whole potential squeamishness about giving Gordon Hayward a multi-year deal and how hard it is to trade him. As long as he's productive, it will be relatively easy to trade him. Like, we see Chris Paul getting traded around year to year, even though he's on a huge ass contract and he's on the wrong side of 30 by quite a margin. So Hayward, absolutely. As long as he's a good player, he can get traded.
And if we're being honest, I don't think Gordon Hayward's next contract is going to be in the neighborhood of the $34 million that he's owed this year. Yeah. I think it's going to be significantly lower.
Even in a sign and trade, like a potential sign and trade, you think it's going to be like 24?
Yeah, I would think it would be closer to the 20 number because there's no way that a team trading for like a 30-year-old player that's coming off some pretty bad injuries would want to commit like $30 million per year. I think the compromise is like, okay, we'll offer you more years, but you're going to take less money.
Yeah.
Right.
And honestly, if you give him a Harrison Barnes contract, I think that's stellar.
Yeah.
That's automatically an upgrade from last year. Might as well.
Yeah.
All right, guys, this has been Fossil along with my co-hosts Rohan and Jay, and we're glad that you got to listen to us talk about the draft and just shoot the shit about trade scenarios and free agency, and we hope to see you guys on a better note next time when the Mavs have definitely acquired Giannis Antetokounmpo, James Harden, Bradley Beal, Zach LaVine, and whoever the hell else.
LeBron James.
And don't you forget that Danny Green's podcast sucks.
Yes.
JJ Redick's podcast is better.
It is. He had Dirk on there, so it's automatically better.